evening, and welcome to episode 94 of the Political Mic podcast. Again, I just want to ask my audience to please forgive my voice as I'm still recovering from being a little bit under the weather last week. To be a congressional staffer on Capitol Hill right now must be, to put it mildly, extremely stressful. All eyes are looking at budget negotiations as the White House is refusing to negotiate with Republicans on raising the debt ceiling, a risky position that Democrats think is a political winner. But it also reflects their scars from previous battles. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen today notified congressional leaders that her office will begin to implement extraordinary measures to keep the United States government from defaulting on its debt. Taking this position that you won't negotiate will allow Republicans to argue that a refusal by the White House to discuss spending cuts amid a rising debt crisis means President Biden is not acting in the public's best interest. But White House officials and Democrats believe they have much more leverage if they do not negotiate. The bottom line is Congress will have a shorter than expected window to negotiate a debt limit increase this year, thanks to policy decisions by both the Biden administration and the Federal Reserve. The impact of two costly moves on the government's finances, President Joe Biden's decision to extend a federal student loan payment freeze, plus the Federal Reserve's rapid interest rate hikes, are under scrutiny as analysts gauge precisely when the United States will run out of money to pay its bills. Identifying that deadline, known as the X date, is crucial as House Republicans and the White House enter a stalemate over how to raise the government's borrowing authority. The United States hit its $31.4 trillion debt limit Thursday, forcing the Treasury Department to use extraordinary measures to avoid a potentially catastrophic default on the nation's financial obligations. Here to help me make sense of all of this behind the scenes is Congressional Communications Director Eric Olsen. After running several campaigns, Eric moved to Washington, D.C. in 2017 after his work with the Obama campaign in 2008, and even serving as a campaign manager for a congressional campaign. He has since worked as a congressional communications director on Capitol Hill. He has a passion for public relations and communications and has partnered with over 500 organizations, one presidential administration, and dozens of members of Congress to coordinate PR campaigns around legislative initiatives and hearings in Congress. Eric, thanks for joining me tonight.
Mike, thank you so much for allowing me to drop some political hot takes on this very cold, rainy Thursday night. I appreciate you. Thank you.
So, Eric, take us behind the scenes. Here we are. You're on Capitol Hill, and both sides seem to have drawn their lines in the sand. What are some of the budget negotiations or concessions, I should ask, that you could see potentially leading to a possible deal so avoid the nation from defaulting on its debt?
I know it might sound crazy to say because the situation is dire, but it's still rather nascent in terms of how the congressional negotiators and leadership are going about this, in terms of what could potentially, be cut here and there. I will say there's a regular order that we do this under every year, and it's called the appropriations process. We have 12 spending bills that are marked up in committees and passed through both the House and the Senate and signed into law. Well, at least that's many years we do continuing resolutions, but there is a normal budget proceeding that, I believe, and I think many others on the Hill believe, would be the proper, institution and forum in which we could have these discussions about how we want to dial back federal spending. I think that, is a worthy discussion. Let's have it. But what we're seeing right now, from my point of view, is a party that is choosing to prioritize division and potentially default over regular order and having this sort of stability and structure that I think the American people would very much like to see out of Washington. It's been a very chaotic few years. And I think you saw in the midterm elections that with a very narrow Senate, very narrow House majority, I think the American people want to see both parties work together. And I think by threatening to torpedo the American economy and our standing abroad by defaulting on our debt for the first time ever is not a good way to go about, doing that. So in terms of what will specifically be cut, I know Republicans, have talked about food assistance. There's a Washington Post article that came out last week talking about their emergency plan to fund DOD, Social Security, Medicare, in the short term, if we have to start doing immediate cuts, that would leave programs like food assistance, the FAA, all of the problems that we're seeing in the airline industry right now, subject to deep cuts, not to mention the impact on the American economy and the American people. So it's still nascent. We still don't know what will come of this, but we're in for, I would argue, an unnecessarily wild ride here in the coming months.
So Eric, what do you make of the administration's position to take a more hardline approach about these budget negotiations in light of the fact that when Biden was vice president during the 2011 discussions about the grand bargain, there are many staffers, I believe, who have it very fresh in their memory that you had a Republican Party under John Boehner, then the Speaker of the House, who just didn't want to accept what normally would have been a great deal with some of the entitlement programs being cut and slashed and reduced. Do you think it's a mistake for the administration to look back at that time period and decide to kind of dig their heels in the sand even more on their position, to not budge as much as Obama was willing to in 2011 during during those discussions with John Boehner during the Great Bargain, which ultimately failed? Obama, I said this in the last show, famously came up on the podium and said, "Can congressional Republicans say yes to anything?" And I asked that also in light of the fact that we're now dealing with a totally different brand of Republicans than the Tea Party in the early days of the Obama administration. We have many Tea Partiers who really stuck it to Kevin McCarthy during the Speaker, confirmation process, and they really wanted to make a point that they were not just going to be fine and settled with just going along to get along. They wanted to make sure that they could take a hardline position against McCarthy, against the establishment wing of their party. And this is rich and ironic because Congress has voted to increase the debt limit more than a dozen times in the last 25 years, 3 times of which took place under President Trump. The Republican Party spent like there was no tomorrow. There was no amount of money that was too high for the border wall, and now all of a sudden everyone wants to become a deficit hawk again. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you speak very well about that. I agree with everything you said. Starting with the fact that under President Trump, by the way, I'm speaking on behalf of myself, not the Democratic Party or anything, but just my view of it is under President Trump, they raised the debt limit 3 times to the tune of $7.8 trillion. And a majority of that money went to what you describe, border security, border walls, but also their giant tax plan, over 80% of which was received, and it would work to the benefit of the top 1% and the wealthiest corporations in this country. So I think in light of that, having over nearly $8 trillion for, I would describe as a tax giveaway to the wealthy in a moment's notice, but not having money to pay our bills, to pay Social Security, to pay Medicare, to pay for things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which is actually reducing costs on various items for the middle class and the working poor in this country. I don't agree with that. All of a sudden, the deficit hawks have returned from flying south for the winter, and all of a sudden they're back. So I think the Biden administration's current handling of this is correct. I think you've seen that Democrats and the administration are looking for many ways to reach across the aisle, find common ground, but they're going to oppose extremism. And when you're choosing division and default over doing the just basic necessities in business of what it takes to function as a government and a society, I don't think you negotiate on those terms, especially when the consequences would be an historic cut to entitlement programs like Medicare, Medi-Cal, Social Security. They're just not going to do that, and I think it's the right move right now. But obviously, we have a lot to sort through in the coming months to see how this all ends up, because we're doing this since 1960, and we've come close 2011, 2013, but this really feels different. And to your point, the Tea Party under Boehner is like child's play to the modern iteration of the Freedom Caucus. These guys are really serious about this threat. So we'll see what happens.
And the thing that makes this budget negotiation so much different than 2011 is that John Boehner told his caucus, look, you don't want to play chicken with this. We don't want to be the ones that are responsible for the government being shut down. But it seems like the Freedom Caucus couldn't care less about whether the government is shut down, because the objective at the end of the day is to be able to go back home and say, I stood my line, I stood my ground, and I didn't yield 1 inch to the other side. And we're in a time when that seems to be more important than actually producing, results. As your communications director, you've been on the Hill for a few times, for a while. You had Representative Don Bacon taking to This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and he said that the Republicans were largely elected. They were largely elected to get control of reckless spending, reckless funding. He said that's the mission that their voters have given them. So when President Biden says he's going to refuse to negotiate with Republicans on any concessions, he doesn't think that's right. They're already, setting the narrative that this administration, although it has, talked a big game about bipartisanship, is already taking a position against any kind of, solution that would require them to work across the aisle. As a communications director, how do you fight back against that narrative as we're entering into a year where, let's face it, 2023 is going to be all about 2024? There'll be a lot of presidential announcements to come. There are some key key gubernatorial races. I'm thinking about Andy Beshear in Kentucky. A lot of what happens on Capitol Hill is going to have far-reaching consequences as it pertains to polling, as it pertains to elections this year. How do you fight back against that narrative as communications director?
Yeah, well, I think you have to add context, right? I have a great deal of respect for Mr. Bacon, the person I work for, and him work together well for a long time. And I understand that everyone's title in that building is representative. You're there to represent a constituency. So if these Republican members of Congress are hearing from their constituents that they want to rein in spending, they want to cut spending, that's our single greatest priority, then I respect that they have a job to do and that they're going to advocate for the interests of their community. Totally understand that. Problem is that they're defining spending as the debt limit, the debt ceiling, and it's not. It's about paying, the bills that we took out yesterday that have now come due. So, I think as a Democrat, as someone who works for a Democrat, and I think the administration, it's incumbent upon us to differentiate the fact that raising the debt limit has absolutely zero zitch nada to do about a single penny in new federal spending, and kind of accentuate how disingenuous that argument is from the other side, because we've done this 78 times since 1960. It's about time we do it a 79th. And I think it's important for us to explain that and also explain why the other side is doing this and practically what that means. That means you're going to get an IOU instead of a Social Security check. Your Medicare is not going to work. You're on Medicaid, there's going to be problems with that. Your 401k, if we truly don't pay the interest this summer, your 401k, your retirement's going to be in jeopardy. We'll have far-reaching, lasting impacts on the economy. And also, one other thing that I think is worth bearing in mind and explaining is most of the time we have these fights, it's when interest rates are rather low, 4 or 5. The fact that interest rates have risen drastically makes this even more politically crazy and asinine, in my view, because you're talking about solid double-digit interest rates that then affect the total debt that the U.S. government has to pay. It'll exacerbate the issue if we make this kind of foolhardy effort when interest rates are already starting off high and would become much higher as a result of defaulting on our debt. So it's bad business. It's bad budgeting. It's kind of unconscionable all the way around. And I think as Democrats, we have to explain everything I just said and also explain the context that Republicans did this under Trump. They did it under Bush. They've done it under many Republican administrations, and actively they're choosing division and default over the proper goings on of the American government. And why are they doing it? Because I think stated in the doctrine of the party right now, they would like to cut taxes further for the richest corporations in America. And I think the richest individuals. And I also think, one of the ways they're going to offset that is by cutting programs that everyday working folks rely on. So, I think it's a message that you're going to see the Biden administration aggressively convey over the coming months, as well as, congressional Democrats and leadership.
So, Eric, I want to ask your opinion. We just got some new congressional committee assignments, House committee assignments, and many have said that some of these assignments have been really like the christening act of the January 6th insurrection, where you have some congressional representatives who are actively supporting or endorsing what happened on January 6th, now being placed in some key committee assignment roles. You have Representative Andy Biggs of Arizona, former head of the Freedom Caucus, also one of the thorns in Kevin McCarthy's side, who will keep his spots on the powerful judiciary and oversight committees. You have Dan Bishop of North Carolina, one of 13 holdouts who ended up flipping to Kevin McCarthy, continuing to serve on both the Judiciary and Homeland Security committees. Lauren Boebert of Colorado, a vocal McCarthy critic and election denier. She was awarded a seat on the Oversight and Accountability Committee, which plans to launch numerous investigations into the Biden administration. You had Josh Brecken of Oklahoma. He's going to be sitting on Homeland Security. You have Marjorie Taylor Greene, someone who has endorsed conspiracy theories and peddled conspiracy theories about 9/11, sitting in Homeland Security. Matt Gaetz, sitting on the Judiciary panel. I can go on and on about how many of these people, are, sitting on some of these committees. And the bottom line is that these people are going to be in charge of some major decisions that go before these committees. We're talking about oversight. We're talking about judiciary. We're talking about national security. What are your thoughts on these committee assignments? And do you have any pause about the effectiveness of Congress moving forward in the 118th session in light of some of these characters taking on some really responsible roles? And if you could also shed some light on what kind of leader that would reflect on Kevin McCarthy, what kind of leaders do these assignments say that he is, being that he was so willing to give anything and everything for the speakership in itself?
Yeah, well, I think unfortunately for Speaker McCarthy, he wrote a lot of checks and it's time for them to be cashed, right? This was the political price. This was the price he had to pay in order to assume the speakership. And it's concerning, I believe I'm there every day. I see these people in the halls every day. I know their staff, and it's not what people, I think, need to understand is they're not cosplaying an alt-right conspiracy theorist, QAnon lover for clout. They genuinely believe these things, and they're going to have top secret security clearances. And as you pointed out correctly, serious investigative and oversight responsibilities on some of the committees they've been assigned to. What does that look like? It means a lot more partisan rhetoric, division, vitriol, and chaos coming from some of these key committees. The television committees, if you will, to some extent, oversight, intel, judiciary, have very high profile hearings that command a lot of attention. Oftentimes the only congressional work a lot of Americans are privy to are that of those committees because their work is so often televised on cable news. But it's concerning. They've made it very clear that their number one priority is to investigate the president, leave no stone unturned. And, if they believe that they have a mandate to do that, they want to do that, then, I'd go for it. But my concern is, that we're going to ignore the other necessary work before us, the appropriations process. You have many congressional Democrats saying, hey, Democrats and Republicans both want to address immigration. Let's get a comprehensive bill done that prioritizes, safety and security, but also compassion. You had the president just over a week ago outline a very comprehensive proposal that he would like to take to congressional Republicans and work with. These are the things that we should be doing. And I guess you can walk and chew gum at the same time. If Republicans want to conduct oversight, legitimate oversight of the administration, all right, but just kind of bogus inquiries that fly in the face of the actual work we have to do, passing legislation, passing a budget, raising the debt ceiling, things like this, it's going to be to the detriment of the American people. And I also think that the American public loves checks and balances. They love to see that there's a semblance of bipartisanship. And I don't think that's going to be translated well if all that's happening is, one party is overturning every stone into, the leader of another party's personal life. It's to score political points. I don't know how well that will be received.
In addition to these committee assignments, McCarthy also made other concessions to the right flank. He vowed that the Freedom Caucus members would be able to get 3 seats on the Speaker Control Rules Committee. And this committee is important. Why? Because it decides exactly how bills are considered on the House floor. In light of that, what are some of the Democratic Party's legislative priorities that you think could reasonably and realistically get a chance of getting on the House floor this session, if any at all?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of bipartisan priorities that will have to get dealt with, one of which is called the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. It's the annual authorization for the military. That's always a strong bipartisan bill. It's always passed on time. Without it, you don't have a fully authorized functioning military. So that's going to get done. And frankly, the way that Congress is so divided right now and kind of at a gridlock and on so many different issues and has been for a decade plus, that's honestly where a lot of our legislating gets done is the NDA. It's an $800 billion piece of legislation. So that's, you're going to see Democrats address a lot of their core principles and priorities and express their values on things like addressing sexual assault in the military, things like addressing the military training death crisis that has taken more lives in recent years than were being taken from the wars abroad. You're going to see Democrats continue their efforts to ensure the U.S. military, the largest institutional consumer of oil in the world, becomes an ally in the fight against climate change by having non-tactical hybrid vehicles and energy resilience and stuff of that nature. And then, I also mentioned it earlier, I think there's a legitimate chance that we could address immigration in a bipartisan manner, with a lot of Democratic input if the American people make it clear that a lot of the kind of politics as usual stuff that Republicans seem positioned to pull here in the first months isn't going to work. If the American people speak and polls dictate that the American people are resoundingly rejecting kind of the dictum that the Freedom Caucus has over the entire Republican caucus, then maybe you'll see Speaker McCarthy in their conference pivot to something bipartisan. I haven't been called an optimist too many times, but that's my optimistic view of things, is that hopefully we pivot to something useful and bipartisan. Democrats, in addition, they're going to, the likelihood of this receiving a vote in this House of Representatives is low, but Democrats are still going to aggressively express and introduce legislation pertaining to protecting the right to choose. Understanding that reproductive rights are human rights and that bodily autonomy is law of the land. They're going to promote women's health by pushing back on restrictive anti-abortion legislation. And certainly if there's a bill introduced in this Congress to institute a federal abortion ban, you'll see Democrats resoundingly opposed to that. But, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the Roe decision this weekend, and I know Democrats are going to aggressively pursue reproductive rights this Congress. Also, things that had bipartisan support should have bipartisan support. Things like the child tax credit, which when it was in effect a couple years ago, was on pace to reduce the child poverty rate in this country by 50%. That's something that we really want to tackle and address. Additionally, pursuing a universal paid family leave policy, so no one has to choose between caring for the family and work ever again. And affordable childcare. You have many Americans spending 20% of their income on childcare. That doesn't work. So that, and of course, protecting and expanding upon the Affordable Care Act. Many members pursuing, Medicare for all and a comprehensive solution to healthcare in this country. Those are all the things that I think we're going to introduce to varying degrees of success. And there's another important thing that congressional Democrats will do, and that's protecting what we've just done. We have a bipartisan infrastructure bill that is going to pay dividends beginning this year and over the next 4 years to rebuild and modernize our public infrastructure system and make it resilient to climate change. You have the Inflation Reduction Act, the single largest climate bill in history, also has a lot of support to reduce healthcare costs. There's deficit reduction in there. We got to protect that and ensure it's implemented properly. Then you have things like the CHIPS Act to bring domestic, American manufacturing jobs back. The first major gun safety legislation in 30 years. And of course, the first marquee bill of the last Democratic Congress was the American Rescue Plan that brought us back from the brink of economic collapse to move us forward with COVID. So there's a lot of implementation on yet to be done on all those bills, except for the American Rescue Plan that we want to ensure is done without interruption and chaos to the benefit of the American people.
So, being that you're one of the key members of a congressional staff, you're very well familiar with some of the relationships that take place that are crucial, many of which are born out of necessity and need, rather than because of genuine, I guess, a genuine desire just to make a relationship. But there are some congressional Republicans in Biden-leaning districts, and many are saying that the Democrats need to lean harder. I'm talking about like those congressional Republicans from New York that surprised a lot of folks, that ended up giving the House very slightly to the Republican Party. What are some of the offices that you see as legitimate like game players, folks who are not beholden to the far right of the party so much so that they cannot bring themselves to support anything, like some real solution builders? Are there any consensus builders in your view left in the party? And if so, what are some of those relationships that you can see being effective to get some of those legislative priorities done?
Sure. At the beginning of the question, you hit a really important point about this city and about this institution, and it is really all about relationships. I've seen bills that were more or less dead on arrival get marked up in committees and sent to the floor to be voted on just because people have good relationships with the relevant folks that be. So it's important to maintain. Although we see a lot of, I think, concerning rhetoric out of parts of the other side of the aisle that certainly gives me pause. It's still important to work with them, negotiate, and maintain solid, positive relationships whenever possible. And they don't get the headlines, but there are some more moderate members of the Republican caucus still. Representative Fitzpatrick co-chairs this caucus called the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is all about Democrats and Republicans jointly addressing issues together. He's broken ranks and voted for strong bipartisan legislation like the infrastructure bill. Notably, he was the only Republican in attendance at the January 6th memorial vigil that we had a couple of weeks ago. So he's a consensus builder, maker of sorts, I think, for the party. Unfortunately, a lot of my friends that worked for other members like that all lost their jobs because their bosses were voted out of office recently. So if we had this interview 4 years ago, I could have listed 10 names for you right away, but it's fewer and farther between. But a lot of the congressional Republicans in New York, you rightly pointed out, are towing a very fine line. They have to take very moderate stances because they're running in Biden plus 8 districts. And there's a lot of chaos and turmoil in the New York Democratic Party this last cycle that I don't anticipate being the same in 2024. Plus, all of the congressional candidates will be buoyed. The Democratic candidates will be buoyed by there being a presidential race in 2024. So, one of the things that's interesting in this Republican rules package that was adopted as well is the minority party has far more of a say, sway, and voice than it has in previous Congresses. So, if we can't reach anything in the debt ceiling and Democrats can, get their 213 votes together for a debt ceiling package and somehow pick off 5 moderate Republicans, that the suburban New York Republican delegation and others, maybe that's how we deal with the debt ceiling. Maybe that's how we deal with reproductive rights. Like there's that when I'm putting my stake in any sort of hope for this Congress, that's what I look at. So, I used to be 15, 20 of them. Now it's maybe 5 to 10 of them, but they're there. And they're not really using their voices right now, but they have them and they're principled. And I can tell you for the fact that they're well staffed, and they'll absolutely be outspoken and hopefully help address a lot of the issues we have before us when the time comes and is needed.
So during the whole debacle that took place, where the Republicans ended up voting 15 times, the House ended up having to vote 15 times before they finally got in line and let McCarthy become the Speaker of the House. I was thinking, about the conversation Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said that she had with Representative Paul Gosar. And according to her, they were talking about the possibility of Democrats possibly giving a few votes over to the Republicans to kind of give McCarthy or whoever, a Republican of their choice, the speakership in exchange for some legislative concessions, in exchange for some concessions on committee assignments and things of that nature. I thought that would have been a really smart way to kind of use the leverage given to the Democratic Party at this point and really play on how slim of a majority this House really is for the Republican Party. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that would have been something that even possibly could have spilled over into leverage to now as we're talking about the debt ceiling negotiations?
Sure. So I think at the time when you're talking about securing the speakership votes, my own personal view, there probably was a good positive PR opportunity there to say, we're united. They're looking at chaos. We'll be the majority makers that you didn't want, but now you have. And I think, part of the problem was I think you had by my rudimentary count, you had 4 or 5 Democrats say publicly on the record they would be willing to come up with a consensus option. I think had the Republicans had to vote 15 more times, then maybe they would have entertained that offer, but it didn't seem like Mr. McCarthy was interested in going that route, though there were some votes there. I think there's, I think there's an opportunity for bipartisanship on very key issues, and I think there's an opportunity for Democrats to stand up and be adults in the room, and transcend above all of it. I think you saw during the speakership elections that this Democratic caucus is very united. You had all 212 of present voting members vote for Mr. Jeffries 15 straight times, and while it's a caucus and a party with it's a very big tent and there's a lot of ideas that come out of it, I still think it's quite united, and I think our unity is our strength. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised in the coming months if we do a clean debt ceiling raise with a couple of Republican votes that we could shave off in the more moderate wing of the party. For the time being, we're opposing extremism, we're opposing division in default over sanity.
So this week has seen yet again another incident of politically motivated violence. You had a 39-year-old felon who overwhelmingly lost a bid for the New Mexico State House as a Republican. He paid for 4 men to shoot at Democratic lawmakers' homes in recent months, including one house where a 10-year-old girl was asleep. The case against the gentleman Solomon Pena, who had posted photos of himself online with Donald Trump campaign material. He's one of dozens across the United States where people have threatened and in some cases attempted to carry out violence against members of Congress, school board members, and other election officials. In Kansas, a trial began this week for a man who prosecutors say threatened to kill a congressman. Officials accused Pena of paying $500 to 4 men to shoot at the homes of Democratic lawmakers. He went along for the final drive-by, his gun jamming as bullets ripped into the bedroom of the girl. The criminal complaint against the self-proclaimed MAGA king describes how anger over his landslide defeat in November led to attacks against the homes of 4 Democratic lawmakers in New Mexico's largest city. A SWAT team arrested him this past Monday. And, we've seen incident after incident. This is just coming off the heels of October, when on October the 28th, when, folks woke up to the news that Nancy Pelosi's husband had an assailant with a hammer bash his head in. And then all of that, of course, after, we had a summer of gun violence, right? Of course, I don't want to link that to politically motivated violence, but then we have January the 6th, the crowning act. I mean, we've had so many different variations of January the 6th since that day. There are people who say, well, they were just protesters. They were peaceful. I even had a gentleman who was promoting a book on this platform argue and say that he believes that there should be no restrictions on free speech because then we'll be on a path to communism and, totalitarian states. And he doesn't even believe that the January 6th, rioters were even violent. I mean, you have so many outlandish beliefs coming out of this. And we see time after time, as time as we get further and further along, acts of these, politically motivated violent acts have become more and more commonplace. And I want to get your thoughts on that, and also what you think could, like, legitimately be done by reasonable consensus builders on both sides of the aisle to kind of put a curb to this.
I appreciate you asking the question. This one is tough for me. It's personal. And it's a really important discussion to have. One of the first things that I remember happening after I started on Capitol Hill was the congressional baseball game shooting, where you had members of Congress get shot with a semi-automatic weapon, if I recall correctly, and you had the Majority Leader Speaker Scalise, or Majority Leader Steve Scalise, come to within an inch of his life. And after, I thought that would sort of be the end of it. I thought that cooler heads would prevail, but people need to understand that these aren't a series of isolated incidents. I have seen over the last 6 years threats to members of Congress's lives precipitously increase. The gentleman I worked for just last month had a very credible death threat against him. And I've had people call our office and list me by name in my home address and threaten to come kill me. A staffer. I'm not the face on TV or anything. I'm not on cable news. And that's happened to my friends as well. We've had our lives directly threatened. Our bosses have had their lives directly threatened. The worst of which was certainly January 6th. I talked to a congressional reporter who literally pulled out her phone on the House chamber and recorded the final will testament of multiple members of Congress who were of full belief that they were going to be killed. And unfortunately, this is what kind of a daily double dose of hyper-partisan media, the big lie, and all this crap does to people. This brand of extremism has been fomenting for the last few years, and we reached a boiling point, 2 years ago, almost to the day. And as political figures, as staff of political figures, it's incumbent upon us. We all have a direct moral obligation, responsibility to tone down the rhetoric and operate in facts. I saw the stuff out of New Mexico this week, and I wish I could say I was surprised. And it's almost, I hate to say it, but it's almost becoming normalized. I mean, when I saw that Speaker Pelosi's husband got his head bashed in with a hammer and was in the ICU, that's major international news. That's chilling. And I felt it exited the kind of national news cycle almost as quickly as it entered. And that's because it's almost, not to sound pessimistic, but it's almost to be expected that when you sign up for a life of public service to be a member of Congress, to be an elected official, it's understood almost at this point that you're putting your life at serious risk and jeopardy. And that goes for the staff too, unfortunately. What's the panacea? What's the remedy? One of the things, I work in communications. One of the things I think we need immediately is comprehensive media literacy courses taught throughout this country. I mean, how to identify between, what is objective journalism and what isn't. Because there is objective and subjective journalism. If people want to, watch Newsmax all day, understand that that's infotainment, understand that's not news. I just think, government, U.S. government was an elective in my high school. in college. It was not required. I never had to learn a thing about our government. I never had to learn a thing about what objective media, journalism looked like. I didn't have to learn media literacy ever in my life. I chose to, but I think that's a long-term solution we seriously need to look at, because this is not a sustainable course we're on right now. How many more people have to be injured or die for the crime of just trying to serve their community and their country?
Why are Democrats seemingly so hesitant to claim the mantle of being the real party for law and order? It just makes sense for them to do that in light of the sympathy and even some of the reluctance on the other side to condemn a lot of these acts, because in a lot of these cases they're motivated by right-wing ideas. I mean, the people who came on the 6th literally had campaign paraphernalia with them. The gentleman who attacked Pelosi's husband did so because he felt as if he was going against this liberal mob who's going to take over the country and change things, and all this nonsense. And now we have this gentleman who himself had a criminal record before he even engaged in this act. He was someone, according to officers, who engaged in a burglary 9 years prior to this. You can go down the list on how many times these incidents have had motivations, political motivations on one side of the aisle. We can make it look like both sides need to condemn it, but let's be clear. I mean, one side is clearly able to condemn it time and time again, and one side has, one good soldier here and there, but for the most part, they're very reluctant. As a communications director, why doesn't the Democratic Party rebrand themselves as the party that's for law and order?
I would say to that question, it's a good question. It's very meritorious. I think watch what we do the next 2 years. I think the party was incorrectly branded by an effective all-out media blitz as the party of defunding the police. That's not what folks in this party believe at all. There are many folks that believe correctly point out that law enforcement, we need to look at training. We need to look at should cops be responding to domestic abuse reports? Should we have social workers respond to that instead? There is important conversations to be had, but certainly I don't believe anyone that's an elected Democrat in the U.S. Congress supports defunding the police. And I think because that message has been played ad nauseum for the last several years, you have a lot of people believing that Democrats are very soft on crime. And I watch the Fox News clips about every day they talk about crime rates going up in liberal cities, et cetera. And I think the party was, caught off guard, I'll say, and delayed in explaining its position that the bedrock, the foundation of, the belief is that they are a party that believes in law and order, especially in contrast to a party that has members who are publicly advocating to defund the Department of Homeland Security, defund the FBI, defund the Department of Justice. Democrats would rather fund those as opposed to get rid of them. So I think watch what we do the next years. I think what we've all done in this party has gone message received. We understand that as crime rates go up in various cities throughout the country, that we need to be proactive about conveying what we're going to do about it as a party and the policies that we want to put forward to address it. So I think you saw a little bit of that in the midterms. And I think it actually worked in some isolated incidents, explaining, the party's view on combating, crime, particularly things like gun violence. And I think you're going to see maybe a more refined message going forward. And I say that based on, folks I talk to at this party, understanding what the American people want, understanding what our values are and why they're in line with, having safe, secure communities. But obviously, it hasn't necessarily been enough in some parts of this country. And to that, I would just say, watch what we do, watch what we say going forward.
So another headline that's a little less serious, but actually it's really serious when you look at it, because we can laugh about some of the allegations and the back and forth and the lying about George Santos, New York uh, congressman representing the third congressional district. But at the bottom line, it's a very crucial thing. When people vote for somebody, you're expecting to vote for a person who's truthful, a person who is who they put themselves out to be in the campaign trail. And there's just been a swirl of lies and controversy around this guy. You have allegations now that he actually misappropriated funds that he was supposed to use for a veteran's dog who had a tumor, $3,000 that he misappropriated. He lied about the fact that his mother had an office on 9/11 in the World Trade Center when his mother actually was in the country in 1999 and then only returned in 2003. And now, there are allegations. I mean, you have the Nassau County Republicans last week saying this is a man who is a disgrace to the party. We want him to step down. And you have George Santos saying, until I get the, I guess, however amount of constituency he had up in New York, saying they want him to step down. He's not stepping down. Kevin McCarthy is so weak because he's unable to say, what this guy did was wrong. And I say this I compare this to how the Democrats handled Anthony Weiner. When Anthony Weiner had allegations against him, Nancy Pelosi was not playing any games. She came up to him and she said, "You've got to go." When I look at the Senate side, when Al Franken had allegations against him in 2017, at the same time, the Republicans were dragging their feet on whether or not to condemn Roy Moore when story after story came after him. Al Franken voluntarily resigned. Here we are with this gentleman who clearly has lied. There's no to both sides to the story.
Right.
Kevin McCarthy's only position is we'll put him through the ethics committee. What is that? And to me, the Democrats need to draw the comparisons between Santos and the Republican Party overall. This is a party who made a lot of fuss about inflation. What have they done since they've taken office? They've only promised to launch investigations and waste your tax dollars on all these different subjects that you don't care about, right? They made you afraid about the immigration crisis at the border. What have they done? What have they proposed to do? Nothing. Crime was an issue for a season. They haven't put forth any serious proposal on crime. Make the comparison. The same way they proposed to be a strong party on solutions in the campaign, and it turns out to be a party of a clown show. George Santos was a candidate who was, a descendant of a Holocaust survivor, a son of a 9/11 survivor, and now he's also a clown. Give us your thoughts on George Santos and this whole situation and the reluctance of this party to really just denounce him the way the Democrats have demonstrated they've been able to do.
It's disheartening. Santos is to Congress what Nixon was to Watergate. It's a man that ensconces himself in a cocoon of lies. And it's pathological. There's something wrong with him. I don't mean that disparagingly to make fun of him. I sincerely think, being a pathological liar is a condition that people struggle with. And I hope that, he seeks and gets help because I think he needs it. And I feel for him in that regard. But I also am appalled that he seems to have been welcomed with open arms by some members of his party, and that the speaker has equivocated on what he wants to do or not do with him. At an ethics committee investigation, we already have a federal we have federal prosecutors looking into this guy's finances. Ultimately, like you raise a good example with the handling of Roy Moore. Ultimately, what we've seen in recent history is that when it comes to, dubious ethical, moral standards with members of this party within Congress or running for Congress, the accountability is not going to come from party leadership. It's just not. It's going to come from the people. It's going to come from the American people. Ultimately, the people that sent Roy Moore packing were the people of Alabama. Instead of Donald Trump or Mitch McConnell, the same people that elected Mr. Santos, thinking that he was a principled Republican, are the same people that are going, "What the hell happened there?" I saw an interview. I think MSNBC or CNN was in his district interviewing Republican voters, and they went, look, I voted red down the ticket as I always did. Had I known any of this stuff about him, I wouldn't have voted for him, would have left it blank, or even voted for the Democrat. So Mr. Santos says he'll resign when his constituents tell him to resign. Hold a town hall. Hold an open, if you mean that, hold an open public forum on a Friday or a Saturday night. Hold it in a basketball gymnasium so as many voices that you want to hear can get in there, and then respect the decision that the group, that the collective makes for you. And if not, then we'll see you in 2 years.
That's an excellent point. And the Democrats, I think they should really pressure him on that. Call his bluff. You say that you care about what the constituents think. You don't care about what everyone else says. Okay, then take it to the constituents. Put this squarely in their court. And you're going to be faced with the Nassau County Republicans who said publicly, we don't want you anymore. You're not who, we thought you were. But Mr. Olsen, I would want to thank you so much for the time that you dedicated. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you. Very informative discussion and very insightful. What are any last closing thoughts that you have for us, as we're, moving towards this debt ceiling crisis? There's the 50th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, like you mentioned. We're entering the third year of the Biden administration tomorrow, January the 20th, 3 years of the Biden administration. Things are going to be revving up really quickly. I know we're in January, but this is going to be a very, very political year with a lot of headlines on the presidential level and then on also the statewide level, especially now that we're in a post-Roe versus Wade America. Any closing thoughts?
Stay informed, stay active. If you care about politics, if you're principled and have a lot of strongly held beliefs, don't just assume that those that represent you do as well. Make your voice heard. My whole career started because I decided I wanted to make volunteer calls for Obama for America, and it really launched a whole career of interest in public policy and advocacy. And so it's, once you get bit by that bug, it never goes away. And I just think there's a lot of personal fulfillment and enrichment that can be had by participating in our political process. I also think there's a responsibility, a moral responsibility to do it. So don't sit in the sidelines. Don't let democracy die in darkness. Stay active, stay engaged. I can say, definitively, as the communications director for a member of Congress, we closely monitor the opinions, the views, beliefs from our constituents. We poll them, we talk to them. We want to know what they think and what they care about so we can best represent them. At least that's how I believe it should work. So don't assume people know what you believe in and care about. Let them know. And stay informed. Media literacy, it's so key. Educate yourselves on what's good and what's fake information. There's a lot of fake information circulating on social media every day. I've fallen victim to like deep fakes on TikTok and Twitter. It happens to all of us. But yeah, those are my closing thoughts. And then, of course, thank you, Mr. Taylor. This has been a great exchange, a great discussion. I appreciate everything you're doing to make the political process more engaging and transparent and digestible for many people.
Thank you, Mr. Olsen. And that's perfectly in alignment with what I always conclude my shows with. I always challenge the viewers, challenge the sources of news that you plug into, right? Make sure that you have educated opinions that are backed in fact. Always verify that what you're looking at in terms of news sources are legitimate sources of news. And that's a key, crucial part of being a citizen and being an informed voter. Thank you so much for what you brought to the table, Mr. Olsen. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and conclude episode 94 of the Political Mike podcast. Thank you all so much for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone.